from contamination to purification. We are getting into a very interesting area in this study. While we were mostly taking initially life lessons from real life experiences, things are getting more symbolic and spiritual in these visions.
And every vision or dream that Daniel had or interpreted up to chapter 7 were a representation of historical events that were to happen in the future of mankind. They were of character more like rulership and kingdoms and dominion, where his vision, second vision that we read about in chapter 8, has more of a spiritual character. There is a goat and a ram and the cleansing of a sanctuary. Something has been contaminated and the day has come to be purified. Why was Daniel so much worn out after this vision? Why was he laying for a few days in exhaustion? Let's dive into this study and find out.
We will first try to identify the main elements and players in the vision and then dig more to understand the message.
This vision happened in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. Daniel saw himself at a specific location near the citadel of Susa. He says, I looked up and there before me was a ram with 2 horns. Further on he says, as I was looking and I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. 2 completely normal animals, nothing hybrid about them. In fact, the appearance of both of them together scratches our memory and reminds us of one special event, holiday in the religious calendar of the Jews called Yom Kippur, or as we also know it, the Day of Atonement. And here is our first clue, the goat and the ram together as a clue connected with something that we're going to be talking a lot about today, the sanctuary.
The scene and atmosphere of this vision is in the context of the sanctuary, and more specifically, how it was cleansed once a year, pointing to the final solution and restoration from sin. The first 2 players are the Medo-Persian and Greek empires, represented by the ram and the goat. The big horn is Alexander the Great, which breaks in 4 after his death, split between his generals. Then, out of the 4 winds of heaven, another horn comes out.
Yes, after the animals, Daniel sees a horn which started small but grew big in power. It grew until it reached the host of heavens. This absolutely parallels with the little horn in chapter 7 that we know about. However, here in chapter 8, it attacked viciously the sanctuary. What do I mean by that? It took over the daily sacrifice by replacing the Christ's intercessory ministry with the intercession of priests. Christ's sacrifice was trampled on, and the way sinners were saved, the way sin was dealt, was completely changed. No doubt in my mind that this was the pagan Rome who grew bigger and transformed itself into the papal Rome, represented by a political religious system that prospered in everything it did according to the vision, and the truth was thrown by it on the ground.
Why does any of this matter? It reveals important aspects of this big conflict between God and Satan, the issue with sin and our salvation. Papal Rome took over and ruined everything that Christ came for and died for. Attacked the sanctuary. In other words, it took over and tried to change how salvation works, our only way to reconcile with God. It created a plethora of false teachings about saints, about death, about intercession, about our relationship with God, about Jesus and salvation. The importance and the signs of God as Creator and Redeemer. But this is not going to be allowed to last forever.
And then comes verse 14, where we are told how the vision ends by the cleansing of the sanctuary. And this is the same sanctuary that is attacked by the little horn. Since it is still functioning, and since the high priest is still working on behalf of God's people, we can only conclude and refer to it as being in heaven. The lesson makes also a timely parallel between this passage in chapter 8 and chapter 7, verse 9 to 14, where the scene of judgment is presented by Daniel. So we have chapter 7 with sitting of the courts and opening the books, the judgment, paralleled with the sanctuary being cleansed in chapter 8. The judgment took place in heaven. So is the cleansing of the sanctuary happening in heaven, not here on earth. Despite of the efforts of the horn and whoever it represents, salvation by faith through Christ remains the only way that God saves us. What Christ did as a sacrifice, what Christ does as a high priest, delivers the sinners from the consequences of their sins and also grants us with undeserving forgiveness.
The symbols and ceremonies that Israel had were pointing to and helping us understand cosmic and spiritual realities. Not that they are the same physical items and processes in heaven, but it represents the essence of dealing with and cleansing from sin. There will be a judgment and cleansing. In the vision, we also see a period of 2,300 days and nights that the lesson translates into 2,300 years based on the historicist method that we discussed in the first lesson. However, it's not clear when does this period start from this chapter. So, this will be continued in the next lesson.
Does that vision confuse you a lot? Does that wears you out to exhaustion? You're not alone. Daniel could not understand it at all. He was appalled by it. However, we live in 2020 and this prophecy was written for our time, and there is knowledge and guidance from God that tells us the meaning of it. God's plan is still on, and His salvation is the only way our souls can be saved. All the contamination caused by the intrusion of sin is being dealt with in the heavenly realm, and it will be resolved as predicted, and then the heavenly sanctuary will be purified, will be cleansed. Looking back in history, I can only be amazed by the accuracy of this prophecy has been unfolding.
Trying to see the big picture and the context of what we are going through in the view of human history does help to better understand the issue and what is at stake. Join us again next week to continue with chapter 9 and the lesson from confession to consolation.